In this video we will explore the second part of the American War of Independence. If you enjoy these videos, please let me know about any events throughout history you would like to see. Now sit back, relax and enjoy. The summer passed in the way that summers pass when you are living inside something enormous, quickly in its days, slowly in its weeks, with a strange compression of time that meant Eli would later struggle to account for those months in any orderly way. They blurred together into a series of impressions: heat, dust, the smell of the camp which never entirely improved, the sound of drilling, the waiting, always the waiting, punctuated by the occasional distant sound of artillery from the direction of Boston like slow, irregular thunder on an otherwise clear day. Fitch recovered. This was not guaranteed. In the beginning, the wound had been deep enough that the surgeon had worn an expression, in those first few days, that communicated very little optimism without actually saying anything directly pessimistic. But Fitch was a man who seemed to have made a private arrangement with his own body, an agreement that it would continue to function as required regardless of what was done to it, and by the end of June he was sitting up, and by mid-July he was walking, and by August he was back at his position with his musket and his grey beard and his expression of experienced, unsurprisable attention, as though the entire business of being shot and recovering from it was simply another thing the world had seen fit to ask of him and he had seen fit to provide. He did not speak much about the wound. He spoke, instead, about what was coming. What was coming, it was becoming increasingly clear, was a longer and harder war than most men had imagined when they set out in the spring. The optimism of those early weeks, the sense that a single dramatic confrontation might settle the matter, that Britain might look at what had happened on the road from Concord and at Bunker Hill and decide that the cost of pressing the argument further was too high, had not exactly evaporated, but it had thinned considerably, like morning mist that retreats before the sun but leaves the ground damp and cold long after it is gone. Britain was not retreating. Britain was reinforcing. More ships had arrived in Boston Harbor over the summer. More troops. The ministry in London had, by all the intelligence available to Washington's army, decided that this was a rebellion to be crushed rather than a dispute to be negotiated, and was preparing to crush it with the kind of systematic, professional thoroughness that empires bring to bear on problems they have decided to solve by force. Washington himself had arrived in July, riding into camp on a gray horse, a tall Virginian in a blue coat, with the bearing of a man who had decided, somewhere in his private self, that bearing was a form of argument, and that if he could look sufficiently certain then the army around him might become what it needed to be. Eli had seen him at a distance, once, riding along the lines close enough to register the size of the man, the quality of his stillness in the saddle, the way the men around him straightened almost involuntarily as he passed, as though his confidence were a physical thing that could be absorbed by proximity. He inspired something. Eli was not sure, in those early weeks, that inspiration was the same as capability, or that presence was the same as strategy. But the army needed something to cohere around, and Washington was, at minimum, that. A letter arrived from home in September. It came through the irregular and unreliable postal arrangement that had developed between the army and the civilian world, letters that might take 2 weeks or 2 months to arrive, that might arrive crumpled and damp and half illegible, or might not arrive at all. Eli had sent 4 letters home by that point and received 2 in return, which meant the system was working at roughly 50% efficiency, which was perhaps better than it deserved. This letter was from Ruth. He sat on a log at the edge of the camp and read it in the low afternoon light, reading slowly because Ruth's handwriting, which had always been small and slightly impatient, seemed to have gotten smaller and more impatient under the pressures of running a farm with one fewer pair of hands, and some words required a second or third attempt before they yielded their meaning. The harvest had been late but adequate. The twins had grown 2 inches each, which Samuel had apparently announced at dinner as a personal achievement, as though height was something you accomplished rather than something that happened to you. His father's knee had been troubling him, which Clara had mentioned only in passing and in terms so understated that Eli understood it was probably worse than she was saying. Patience was well. He smiled at that. Patience is well. Ruth had included it with the same matter-of-fact brevity she would use to report on any member of the household, which meant she had either developed an unexpected affection for the horse, or more likely she had understood that Eli would want to know, and had included it for him without drawing attention to the fact that she had done something considerate. Peter Cole, the letter said, near the end, was spoken of well by the men in his company. There was no other reference to Peter Cole. But the fact that she had found occasion to include the information, and the particular way she had phrased it spoken of well told Eli a great deal about the state of things at home, and he folded the letter back into his coat with a feeling that was warm and aching in equal measure. He was glad they were all right. He was glad he knew it. He was very, very far from home. October brought rain. Not the clean, passing rain of summer, the kind that freshens things, that patters briefly on canvas and then moves on, but the long, gray, determined rain of a Massachusetts autumn that arrives as though it intends to stay, settling in over the hills with a kind of institutional permanence, turning the camp into a study in mud and misery. The tents leaked. The fires were difficult to keep. Clothing that got wet in the morning stayed wet until the afternoon, by which time it was getting wet again. Eli had not understood, before this, how much of war was simply the management of physical discomfort. He had not understood that cold and wet and hunger were not occasional interruptions to the business of soldiering, but its permanent background conditions, the medium in which everything else occurred, the way water is the medium in which a fish moves. You did not escape the discomfort. You learned, over time, to move through it as efficiently as possible, to make the small adjustments, the extra layer, the particular way of angling your blanket, the discipline of keeping your feet as dry as could be managed, which was never very dry, that meant the difference between functional misery and the kind of misery that stopped a man from being useful. Fitch was a teacher in this, as in other things. He had a small oilcloth, which he had brought from home with a foresight that most of the younger men had not possessed, and he used it to keep his powder dry with a consistency so reliable it seemed almost religious, a daily ritual of checking and covering and protecting the one thing that, in the end, was the difference between a soldier and a man standing in a field holding a stick. He shared what he knew about keeping warm, about sleeping in the wet, about the particular trick of finding the dry center of a stack of firewood when the outside of it was soaked through. He shared it without condescension, as practical information that any sensible person would want to have. The army that survives the winter, he said once, wringing out his coat with the methodical patience of a man who has done this many times before, wins more battles than the army that doesn't. It was in October, during a night watch in the cold rain, that Eli let himself think the thought he had been keeping at a careful distance since July. He was on picket duty at the edge of the camp, the darkness beyond him absolute, the rain soft and persistent on his hat, the camp behind him a distant warmth of fires and voices, and he was alone with himself in the way that night watch made you alone, not lonely, exactly, but solitary in a way that allowed the thoughts you kept busy during the day to arrive quietly and stand beside you and wait to be acknowledged. The thought was this: he did not know how long he could do this. Not the physical part, the rain and the cold and the hunger and the walking. The body knew how to manage those things now, had learned the management of them through months of practice. He meant the other part. The part that was harder to name. The part that was the distance between himself and home, and the not knowing of what was happening there, and the sense growing slowly, steadily, in the back of everything that the life he had left in April was changing in his absence in ways that could not be undone. That the farm was continuing without him. That the twins were growing without him. That whatever Ruth and Peter Cole were or were not to each other was developing in a story he was not present in. That the world at home was not paused, waiting for him to return. It was moving. It was always moving. He stood in the rain and held this thought for a while. And then he adjusted his hat against the rain, and picked up his musket, and walked his picket line in the dark, one foot and then the other, as he had always done, as he would go on doing. Because he had come of his own decision. And the decision still held. The army had been retreating for months. This was the truth of it, stripped of the careful language that commanders used in dispatches and that men used with each other when they wanted to maintain the fragile architecture of morale. They had retreated from New York through the autumn, across New Jersey, falling back before the British advance with the grinding, dispiriting logic of an army that was being outmanned and outmaneuvered and was running short of almost everything: men, ammunition, food, and perhaps most damagingly, the sense that any of it was going to turn out well. Eli had been present for all of it. He had been present at Long Island in August, where Washington's army had been badly beaten and had escaped destruction only through a night crossing of the East River in small boats, moving through fog so thick you could not see the man in front of you, only hear his oars. He had been present at the retreat through Manhattan and through the autumn countryside of New Jersey, watching the army shrink around him as men whose enlistments had expired chose not to re-enlist, chose instead to go home, and who could blame them? Eli had thought more than once, watching them go, who could honestly blame a man for deciding that he had given enough of himself to something that seemed to be losing? He had not gone home. He was not sure, on the worst days of those autumn retreats, exactly why not. The decision he had made in April of 1775, the decision that had still held, through the rain and the cold and the long watches, had been tested in those months in ways that made the testing at Bunker Hill look almost simple by comparison. Bunker Hill had been one terrible afternoon. The retreat through New Jersey was weeks of daily diminishment, of cold and hunger and the specific, corrosive misery of moving away from something rather than toward it. But he had not gone home. Fitch had not gone home either. He walked beside Eli through those retreating miles with the same steadiness he brought to everything, neither cheerful nor despairing, simply present, a man making his way through difficulty with the patient competence of someone who has long since stopped expecting difficulty to apologize for itself. Webb, the cooper's apprentice, was still with them too. He had grown, over the past year, in ways that had nothing to do with height. The shallow-breathing boy of Bunker Hill had become something more settled, not hardened. Exactly, that was not quite the right word, but seasoned in the way that wood is seasoned. The same material, but denser, more reliable, less likely to warp under pressure. And Peter Cole was still with them. Which meant that Ruth's story, whatever it was still unresolved, still held in suspension somewhere between the letters and the silences and the small careful references that both Eli and Cole maintained with the delicacy of men navigating around something fragile. They reached the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware in early December. Washington had ordered the crossing of the river to put it between the army and the British advance, and the crossing itself had been a grim, exhausting business, boats laden with men and horses and cannon moving back and forth across the dark water while the ice came down in chunks from upstream, the boatmen cursing quietly and the men holding on and not speaking. Eli had crossed near midnight, sitting in the bottom of a flat-bottomed Durham boat with 12 other men, watching the far bank approach with the numb, almost dreamlike quality of someone who has been cold for so long that cold has become his natural state and warmth is something he only dimly remembers. On the Pennsylvania side, they had made what camp they could. It was not much of a camp. The army that assembled itself on the western bank of the Delaware in December of 1776 was approximately 2,000 men in various states of exhaustion and deterioration. Some had no coats. Some had no boots, actual boots, leather and sole and structure, and wrapped their feet instead in whatever cloth was available, which left bloody prints in the snow when they walked, a detail that Eli noticed and then made a deliberate effort to stop noticing because there was nothing he could do about it, and looking at it only made the helplessness worse. Washington moved among the men. Eli saw him several times in those dark December days, always moving, always present, always with that same quality of contained, deliberate calm that seemed to cost him enormously without ever visibly depleting him. He was present at the fires, at the picket lines, at the supply tents where the shortages were most painfully apparent. He spoke to the men, not speeches, not exhortations, but the ordinary words of a commander walking among his people, noticing them, acknowledging that he saw what they were enduring. Eli heard him once, at close range, speaking to a group of men whose boots had given out entirely. Washington had looked at their feet for a moment, those wrapped, bleeding feet in the snow, and his face had shown something that was not pity, exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that contained in it the weight of what it meant to ask men for this kind of sacrifice. And then he had spoken, quietly, and what he said was not about glory or liberty or the cause, but simply about shoes. That shoes had been sent for. That they would come. That he was sorry they had not yet arrived. The men had nodded. It was enough, somehow. Not the shoes, which had not yet arrived, but the seeing, the being seen. It was Fitch who told Eli about the plan. They were sitting by a small fire on the evening of Christmas Day, a Christmas that had passed with the particular bleakness of significant days observed under impossible conditions, the calendar date existing entirely at odds with every quality of their actual circumstances. Someone had produced a small amount of rum, which had been shared with the careful equity of men dividing something precious, each man receiving approximately enough to feel the warmth of it for perhaps 2 minutes before it was gone. "We're going back across," Fitch said, without preamble. Eli looked at him. "Tonight. In the dark. Washington's orders." Fitch looked into the fire. "There's a Hessian garrison at Trenton. The other side of the river, 9 miles south. They'll have celebrated Christmas in their own way, most likely. Washington means to hit them before the morning." Eli was quiet for a moment. "Cross the river," he said. "Tonight. In that." He gestured toward the Delaware, visible as a dark movement between the trees, carrying its cargo of ice downstream with a slow, grinding persistence. "In that," Fitch agreed. There was a pause. "Well," said Eli. "Well," said Fitch. The crossing began at 11 o'clock at night. It was, from beginning to end, an exercise in controlled terror. The river was worse than it had been 2 weeks before. More ice, moving faster, the cold so deep and absolute that it seemed to have weight, to press down on the men in the boats with a physical force. The boatmen, Durham boatmen, experienced men who knew this river in all its moods, worked with fierce concentration, pushing the ice back with their poles, keeping the boats moving through the black water by a combination of skill and something that had to be called courage, though they were watermen and not soldiers and had come to this particular form of service by a different path. Eli sat in the boat and listened to the ice. It made a sound against the hull that he had not expected, a percussive, irregular sound, part knock and part scrape, as though the river itself was registering its objection to what was being asked of it. The cold came up through the wooden hull and through his coat and into his bones with a thoroughness that was almost impressive. He could not feel his feet. He could feel his hands only because he was gripping the side of the boat with them, and even that feeling was more pressure than sensation. Beside him, Webb was looking straight ahead at the far bank, his jaw set, breathing slowly. Long and slow. "It helps." Eli almost smiled. On his other side, Fitch sat with his eyes half closed, in the particular state of patient suspension that Eli had come to recognize as the old man's method of enduring things, not fighting the discomfort, not pretending it wasn't there, but simply declining to give it more attention than it strictly required. The far bank came closer. Closer. And then the boat grounded on the shore and men were moving, climbing out into water that came up to their knees and was so cold it stopped the breath entirely for a moment, and Eli was among them, moving up the bank, musket held above his head, the shock of the water receding as his legs found solid ground and his body remembered what it was for. They formed their lines in the dark and the snow and began to march. 9 miles to Trenton. The battle, when it came with the gray of the morning, was brief and decisive in the way that surprise can make things brief and decisive. The Hessian garrison, professional soldiers, well-trained and well-armed, but caught entirely unprepared in the cold morning after their Christmas celebrations, put up a fight that was real and not to be dismissed, but that lasted perhaps 4 to 5 minutes before their commander was mortally wounded and the resistance collapsed. 900 prisoners. No colonial dead. Eli stood in the street of Trenton in the gray morning light, his musket in his hands, his feet entirely without sensation below the ankle, and looked at the scene around him with a feeling he could not immediately name. It was not triumph. It was too exhausted for triumph, too cold, too aware of everything it had cost to get here. It was something quieter than triumph, something more durable. He had crossed the river. In the dark, in the ice, when everything was against it, when a reasonable man might have looked at the black water and the moving ice and the 9 miles on the other side and decided that enough was enough. He had crossed. He had learned, by now, not to measure time in days. Days were too small a unit for what they were living through. A day at Valley Forge could contain so much cold and hunger and monotony and effort that measuring your survival in days felt both too granular and too optimistic, as if counting each one implied a confidence about the next that the circumstances did not support. He measured time instead in tasks completed and fires kept and the small, manageable victories of having made it through another night with his health intact and the men around him still present. There were 12,000 men at Valley Forge that winter. By spring, nearly 3,000 of them would be dead. Not from battle, from cold, and from hunger, and from the diseases that moved through a camp of cold and hungry men with the efficient, unhurried thoroughness of something that has been given all the time it needs and no opposition worth mentioning. Typhus, mostly. Dysentery. Pneumonia. The slow, unglamorous killers that wars produce in far greater numbers than their battles do, and that the histories of wars tend to mention briefly and in passing before returning to the movements of armies and the decisions of generals. Eli would think about this later, about how much of what he survived at Valley Forge had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with luck. With a particular, unearned fortune of a body that happened to resist the cold a little better than the man sleeping next to him. He had no special virtue in this. He was simply, for reasons he could not account for, still standing when others had fallen, and that fact carried a weight that was not pride but something more uncomfortable, the weight of the arbitrary, the weight of having been spared without deserving it more than the men who were not. The huts were built in the first weeks of December. Washington had ordered them constructed according to a standard design, 14 feet by 16, 6.5 feet high, with a fireplace at one end and bunks along the walls, and the army had built them with the urgent, focused energy of men who understood that the alternative to building them was sleeping outside in a Pennsylvania winter, which was not an alternative at all. Eli threw himself into the work with a gratitude for its physical demands that he had not expected. The felling and hauling and hewing of timber, the mud and wood construction of the walls and roofs, all of it was exhausting and all of it was purposeful, and purposeful exhaustion was an infinitely better condition than idle suffering. The hut he shared with Fitch and Webb and Cole and 8 other men was not comfortable by any measure that the word comfortable usually implies. It was smoky. The chimney drew poorly in the first weeks, filling the interior with a gray haze that made every man's eyes water and gave the whole space the quality of existing inside a cloud. It was cramped. The men who slept nearest the walls woke each morning with frost on their blankets from the cold seeping through the timber. And the smell, in a space of 12 men living at close quarters through a winter without adequate water for washing, was something that Eli eventually simply stopped perceiving, the way you stop perceiving a sound that has been present long enough to become part of the background of the world. But it was shelter. It was a roof and walls and a fire, however reluctant. And after the open bivouacs of the autumn retreats it felt, in its way, like a kind of luxury. "It's almost comfortable," Webb said one evening, sitting by the fire with his feet extended toward it, his expression the expression of a man making the best possible case for his situation. "Don't," said Fitch, without looking up from the piece of leather he was mending. "I'm serious. Compared to sleeping in a ditch in the rain." "If your standard of comparison is sleeping in a ditch in the rain," Fitch said, "then almost everything looks comfortable, and you have learned nothing useful." Webb considered this. "Still," he said. Fitch made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite dismissal, somewhere in the territory between the two, and went back to his mending. Eli, listening from his bunk, felt something shift in his chest, a small, involuntary warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. These men. This ridiculous, smoke-filled, frost-rimmed hut. The specific texture of the life they had built together in the worst of circumstances, the particular way they occupied the same space, the rhythms of it, the habits, the private shorthand of people who have been through enough together that communication has simplified itself down to the essentials. He had not expected this. He had not expected that the worst experience of his life would also contain this. The hunger was constant. This is the simplest way to say it, and the most accurate. It was not occasional or intermittent, it was the permanent ground condition of everything, the base note underneath every other experience, present when he woke and present when he slept and present in the dreams he had when he slept, which were with increasing frequency dreams about his mother's cooking. The spiced pudding from that last Christmas at home. The salt pork and beans that had seemed so inadequate in the early days of the siege outside Boston and that now seemed, in memory, to belong to some era of almost unimaginable abundance. The supply system had failed, as it so often failed. The Army's quartermaster arrangements were inadequate for an army of this size, and the roads to the camp were poor, and the farmers of the surrounding countryside, some loyal to the crown, some simply unwilling to accept the continental currency that was the only payment available, were not always cooperative. What food arrived was distributed with as much equity as the circumstances allowed, which meant that what each man received was approximately enough to keep functioning and nowhere near enough to feel well. Eli had learned to ignore hunger the way he had learned to ignore cold, not by pretending it was not there, but by moving alongside it rather than against it, giving it no more attention than it strictly required and directing the remainder of his attention to whatever task was currently available. But there were days when this discipline was harder than others. There was one day in late January, gray and bitterly cold, a day when the wind came down from the north and found every gap in the hut's construction with the dedicated thoroughness of something looking for a way, and when Eli sat in the hut for an hour in the middle of the afternoon and could not make himself stand up. Not because he was ill. Not because he was injured, but because the accumulated weight of everything, the months, the cold, the hunger, the distance from home, the deaths he had witnessed, the faces of the men who were no longer in the camp, had arrived all at once in a way he could not manage by moving through it, and he sat on his bunk and felt it for a while and let it be what it was. Fitch came in from the cold and looked at him. He did not ask what was wrong. He had been alive long enough to recognize the look of a man bearing something heavy, and wise enough to know that the wrong response to that look was a question. He sat down on his own bunk, across the narrow space. He said, after a while, "You know what I think about, on the bad days." Eli looked at him. "I think about what it means that I'm still here." Fitch's voice was quiet, unhurried, the voice he used when he was saying something he meant rather than something he thought was useful. "Every man I knew in the French War, I can tell you which ones quit. And I can tell you, all these years later, I never heard a one of them say they were glad they did. Not a single man." He paused. "The ones who stayed, most of them didn't survive. But the ones who did, there's something in them that you can't get any other way. Something they carry that I can't put a name to, but I know it when I see it." He looked at Eli directly. "You have it already," he said. "You've had it for a while. I'm just telling you so you know." Eli looked at the floor of the hut for a moment. Then he stood up. "It was at Valley Forge that Josiah Webb died. He did not die in battle. He died on a Tuesday afternoon in February, in his bunk, of a fever that had started as what seemed like a bad cold and had worsened over 4 days with a speed and thoroughness that the surgeon, overworked, undersupplied, doing what he could with what he had been unable to check. Eli was with him at the end. He sat beside the bunk and held Webb's hand, those hands that had learned to load a musket and dig earthworks and build a hut and do all the 100 things that soldiering asked of them, and he did not speak very much, because there was not very much to say that was adequate, and he had learned by now that inadequate words were worse than silence. Webb had said, near the end, in a voice that was very tired, "Tell my father I wasn't afraid." Eli had said that he would. He did not know if this was true. He suspected Webb had been afraid that most men are, when it comes to it, afraid, but he understood that this was not what the words meant. They meant something different. They meant, "Tell him I didn't run. Tell him I stayed. Tell him that the thing he hoped I was, I tried to be." "I'll tell him," Eli said. Webb had closed his eyes. The fire in the corner of the hut burned on, small and steady, the way fires do, indifferent to everything except their own continuation. He arrived on a gray February morning, this large and unlikely man, riding into Valley Forge on a horse that seemed slightly overwhelmed by its passenger, not because the horse was small, but because the man upon it was so thoroughly, exuberantly present that he seemed to occupy more space than his physical dimensions strictly required. His name was Friedrich Wilhelm August Heinrich Ferdinand von Steuben. He was a Prussian, a former officer of Frederick the Great's army, which was at that time considered the finest military machine in Europe, an army built on discipline and drill and the precise, repeated practice of movement until movement became instinct, until a column of men could load and fire and advance and wheel and reform, not as a collection of individuals making individual decisions but as a single coordinated thing, a thing that responded to command the way a well-made instrument responds to a skilled hand. He spoke almost no English. This was, initially, a significant obstacle. He had brought with him a young French-speaking aide named Pierre, who translated his commands into French, which were then translated into English by a second interpreter, which meant that an instruction from von Steuben to his drilling men passed through two languages before arriving at its destination and lost, in transit, something of the original's vigor, let us say though what it gained, in those early confused sessions on the drilling ground, was a quality of unintentional comedy that the men found, Eli noticed, surprisingly restorative. The Baron himself seemed to grasp this quickly. He was a man of considerable intelligence beneath the volume, and he understood that an army's willingness to be trained depended in part on its willingness to show up for training, and that men who were entertained by their instructor were more likely to return than men who were merely drilled by him. When his instructions, filtered through two languages, produced results that were not what he had intended, when a company of men turned left instead of right, or marched confidently in completely the wrong direction, he received the outcome with an expression of theatrical despair that was at least partly genuine and at least partly performance, and the men laughed, and laughed again, and came back the next morning. Eli had not laughed much since Webb died. He had functioned. He had done what was required of him, had maintained the routines of camp life and the disciplines of his picket duties and the small, careful acts of looking after himself and the men around him that had become, over the months, a kind of second nature. But the laughter had gone somewhere, the way color goes out of a landscape in winter, not permanently, but completely enough that you stop expecting it. Von Steuben's drilling ground brought some of it back. Not on the first day. On the first day, the men of the Model Company, 100 soldiers selected from across the army to be trained first, who would then train the others, assembled on the open ground near the camp's center with the slightly mutinous body language of men who had been asked to do something new when they were cold and tired and still grieving and not entirely sure what the point was. But the Baron moved among them with a quality of energy that was almost alarming in a man who had arrived at a half-frozen army camp after a very long journey. He touched their elbows, adjusted their stances, corrected the angle of a musket with the matter-of-fact precision of a craftsman who sees immediately what needs correcting and corrects it without judgment or drama. He was not condescending. He was not impatient in the way that condescension disguises itself as patience. He was simply, thoroughly, convinced that these men could do what he was asking, and his conviction was so complete and so apparently genuine that it was difficult, standing in its presence, not to begin to share it. "He thinks we're soldiers," Cole said to Eli one evening, with an expression of mild surprise. "We are soldiers," Eli said. "I know. But he thinks we're soldiers like his Prussians are soldiers. Like we can be that kind of soldier. Maybe we can." Cole considered this. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. "Maybe," he said. The drilling was, in its way, a form of salvation. Eli understood this only gradually, but once he understood it, the understanding was clear and complete. The problem with Valley Forge, with all the long months of endurance that had preceded it, was not primarily physical. The body could manage cold and hunger better than the mind could manage purposelessness. What eroded men at Valley Forge, what had eroded Eli on that January afternoon when he could not stand up, was not the suffering itself but the suffering without visible result. The sense that they were enduring simply in order to continue enduring, that there was no momentum, no forward motion, no visible connection between what they were going through and any outcome they could imagine. Von Steuben's drill provided motion where there had been stillness. Every morning, in the cold, On the open ground, men moved. They moved in patterns that became, over days and then weeks, increasingly precise. They loaded and fired in sequence. They advanced in line. They wheeled and reformed. They learned the commands in English, eventually, painstakingly translated by Pierre and then simplified into something that could be shouted across a drilling ground and understood immediately, and they practiced the responses until the responses became automatic, until the body knew what to do before the mind finished processing the instruction. And something happened in that process that was larger than drilling. Something happened to the men as men. Eli felt it in himself first, and then saw it in the men around him, a quality of re-engagement, of investment, of having something to learn and improving at it. The particular satisfaction of doing a thing badly on Monday and better on Wednesday and competently by Friday, of being able to look at what you could do now and see clearly that it was more than what you could do before. It was a small thing, perhaps, measured against the enormity of everything they were enduring. But small things, Eli had come to understand, are not nothing. Small things, accumulated, become large things. Small improvements, sustained, become transformation. Fitch watched the drilling with the expression of a man whose private views are being confirmed by events. A disciplined army, he said one morning, watching a company wheel in reasonable unison across the drilling ground, is a different animal from an armed crowd. The British have always known this. Now we're learning it. Is that why we've been losing? Eli asked. Fitch looked at him sideways. That's one of the reasons, he said. Losing is usually a combination of reasons. Winning too, for that matter. March came in like what it was the beginning of the end of the worst of it, not warm yet, not even reliably above freezing, but carrying in its grey skies a quality of relenting that the February skies had entirely lacked. The ice in the creek that ran along the southern edge of the camp began to break up. Mud that had been frozen solid softened again, which created its own problems but also signified a direction forward, toward spring, toward the thaw that meant roads passable and supply wagons moving and something other than salt pork and hard bread arriving at the camp with some regularity. Letters came. Eli received 2 in the same week, one from his father, one from Ruth, and read them both sitting in a patch of thin March sunlight outside the hut, his back against the wall, the pale warmth of it on his face like something being slowly, carefully restored. His father's letter was short, in the way that his father's letters always were, compact and precise, each sentence carrying more weight than its length suggested. The farm was well. The eastern field had produced a good crop. The one Eli had planted in the spring of 1775, his father had continued planting it. The twins were now 14 and had begun to be useful in ways they had not previously been, which was a development his father described with the same matter-of-fact satisfaction he would use to describe any agricultural improvement. His father had added, at the end, in writing that was slightly different from the rest, slightly slower, as though it had been composed with more care. The things you are doing are not small things. I want you to know that I understand this. Your grandfather would have understood it too. Eli read this several times. Then he folded the letter and held it in his hands for a while, in the thin March sunlight, with the sound of drilling coming from the ground across the camp, the steady, rhythmic sound of men learning to move together, learning to be what they needed to be. Ruth's letter contained, near the end, mentioned almost in passing, the information that she and Peter Cole had reached an understanding. Eli read the sentence and then read it again. Then he set the letter down in his lap and looked at the sky for a moment, that pale March sky with its thin, watery light, and felt something move through him that was complicated and warm and not entirely free of grief for Webb, who would never receive a letter like this, but that was nonetheless something he would, in the absence of a better word, call happiness. He would write back tonight. He would say that he was glad. Because he was. By the time the snow had fully gone and the first green was coming up in the fields around the camp, the army at Valley Forge was a different army from the one that had arrived in December. Not different in its material circumstances, those remained difficult, in ways that would not be fully resolved that spring. Not different in its losses, which were permanent, but different in the way it moved, the way it held itself, the way the men on the drilling ground looked when they wheeled and fired and reformed with a precision that would have been unimaginable 4 months before. Eli stood on the drilling ground one April morning and looked along the line of men he knew, men whose names he knew, men whose habits and fears and private qualities he knew, the way you know things about people you have survived something with, and he felt, not for the first time but more clearly than before, that this was not simply an army. It was a people, learning what it was. It was a country, in the making. He did not have grand words for this. He was a farmer from western Massachusetts, not a philosopher. But he felt it, standing in the April morning, the new green coming in the fields around him, the sound of the drilling going on behind him, the grandfather's musket in his hands. He felt it, and it was enough. The heat was the thing nobody had prepared him for. He had thought, after Valley Forge, that he understood the full range of what weather could do to a man. He had thought that cold, the deep, structural cold of that Pennsylvania winter, was the worst that the physical world could offer a soldier in the field. He had been wrong. The heat of that last week of June in New Jersey was a different kind of assault entirely, not the sharp, honest hostility of cold, which at least announced itself clearly and could be managed with enough wool and enough fire, but something more insidious, more patient, more interested in gradual conquest than direct attack. The column moved through it like men walking through something thicker than air. The road from Valley Forge to Monmouth was nearly 100 miles, and they had been walking it for days in temperatures that climbed each afternoon into a range that made the word hot seem entirely insufficient. Men fell out of the march not from cowardice, not from the failure of all that had haunted the retreats of 1776, but simply from the body's refusal to continue past a certain point, the body's absolute and non-negotiable insistence that it had reached its limit and would now lie down regardless of what the mind had to say about it. Eli kept moving. He kept moving the way he had kept moving through everything, one foot, then the other, breath slow and steady, attention on the immediate rather than the total, the next mile rather than the miles remaining. He was sweating through his coat from the first hour of the march each morning, and by afternoon his mouth was a dry and aching thing, and the canteen at his hip felt lighter with every mile, and the road ahead shimmered in the heat in a way that made it look like it was on the edge of becoming something else entirely. Beside him, Fitch marched with the unhurried steadiness that had long since stopped surprising Eli. The old man sweated as much as anyone and drank his water as carefully as anyone and said nothing about the heat that was not strictly practical. He was, Eli had decided some time ago, either genuinely inured to physical discomfort or in possession of a private philosophy about it so deeply held that it had become indistinguishable from the real thing. Cole marched on Eli's other side. He had been quieter than usual since the letter about Ruth, a different quality of quiet than before, not the quiet of holding something in but the quiet of a man who has something good to think about and is content to think about it without sharing it, the way you hold warmth from a fire even after you've moved away from it. The orders, when they came on the morning of the 28th of June, came in the confused and piecemeal way that battle orders often do, fragments of instruction passed down through the chain of command, each fragment slightly different from the one before it, the overall picture assembling itself slowly and imperfectly from the parts. What Eli understood, by the time the column had been redirected and positioned, was this: the British rear guard, commanded by a general named Cornwallis, was engaged somewhere ahead of them. An American advance force had made contact, and then this was the part that arrived with a particular quality of disbelief: had retreated. Had been ordered to retreat by their commander, a general named Lee, whose decisions that morning would be debated and disputed and ultimately condemned for years afterward. Washington himself had ridden into the retreating column. Eli did not see this directly, but he heard it from men who had the account, passing back through the ranks with the speed that significant things travel in armies. Washington on his white horse at the head of the retreating men, his composure for once entirely abandoned, his voice carrying across the field with a force and fury that men who witnessed it would remember for the rest of their lives. The retreating force halted, turned, began, under Washington's direct and personal authority, to reform. And the army that von Steuben had drilled through the winter was called upon, for the first time, to show what it had become. They went in on the left flank, in the full heat of the afternoon. Eli had been in battle before Bunker Hill, the desperate skirmishing of the New York retreat, Trenton in the dark, but he had not been in a battle like this. Those had been actions of confusion and smoke and desperate improvisation, affairs in which survival depended more on instinct and fortune than on anything that could be called military science. This was different. The line advanced on command. It advanced in order, dressed properly, moving together, the men keeping their intervals with a precision that 3 months ago would have been unimaginable and that now, incredibly, felt almost natural. The British line ahead of them was visible through the heat haze, red coats and white breeches and the glint of bayonets, and it was delivering fire, volley fire, professional and accurate, and men in Eli's line were falling, one here, one there, with the terrible randomness of it, the way battle chooses without preference or logic. The line kept moving. Load, temp, prime, fire. The mechanics so deeply learned by now that his hands moved through them while his mind was somewhere else, somewhere behind his eyes, watching the field, watching the British line, watching the men around him with the particular distributed attention that Fitch had taught him, the attention that was not fixed on any one thing but was open to everything, responsive without being reactive. Hold the line, Aldrich's voice, somewhere to his right. Hold the line and keep moving. They held the line. They kept moving. It was in the middle of the afternoon, in the fiercest part of the fighting, that Eli saw Washington again. He was perhaps 30 yards away, closer than Eli had ever been to him, riding along the line in the full chaos of the battle, in the heat and the smoke and the noise, with an expression of such absolute focused purpose that he seemed almost to exist in a different register from everything around him. Not untouched by it, no one in that field was untouched by it, but undeterred by it, which was a different thing entirely. He moved along the line, and where he went the line steadied, not because he said anything particularly remarkable, but because he was there, because his presence was itself a form of argument, an embodied assertion that this was holdable and that they were going to hold it. He passed within 20 feet of Eli. Their eyes did not meet. Washington was looking at the line, at the field, at a dozen things at once, but Eli saw his face clearly for a moment, and what he saw there was not what he might have expected. It was not serenity. It was not the composed, marble certainty of a man who knows how things will turn out. It was something rawer than that, the face of a man under enormous strain, holding himself together by will and by the conviction that if he did not hold himself together, the men around him would not hold either. It was the face of a man doing the hardest thing, which is not the dramatic thing but the sustained thing, the thing that requires you to keep being what people need you to be, hour after hour, when every instinct is screaming at you to stop. Eli filed this away somewhere deep. He would think about it for years. The British broke contact at dusk. They withdrew in good order. They were professionals, and professionals do not rout easily, but they withdrew, and the field at Monmouth Court House, when the guns went quiet and the smoke began to clear in the long golden light of the summer evening, belonged to the Continental Army. Eli sat on the ground where the line had stood and let the silence arrive around him. His hands were shaking in the way they always shook after a battle, that particular tremor of released tension, the body's delayed acknowledgement of what it had just been through. He was thirsty in a way that went beyond ordinary thirst, a cellular, foundational thirst that was not going to be resolved by one canteen or two. His ears were ringing with the particular high, thin sound of ears that have been too close to too much noise, and the world had the slightly unreal quality that everything had in the immediate aftermath of fighting, as though the surface of things had been briefly stripped away and not quite finished returning. Fitch sat down beside him. Cole sat on his other side. Neither of them spoke for a while. They sat on the ground in the fading light of that extraordinary day, these three men who had come a very long way together from a township in western Massachusetts, and they were alive, and the field was theirs, and the army they were part of had proven, on the hardest possible ground, in the worst possible heat, against the finest professional soldiers in the world, that it was what 6 months of drilling and endurance and suffering had made it. "Well," said Fitch, eventually. He said it in the same tone he had used at Bunker Hill, at the crossing of the Delaware, at every significant juncture of the past 3 years, that same two-syllable acknowledgement of a thing that had happened, that contained within it neither exultation nor despair but simply the precise, weighted recognition of a fact.
"Well," said Eli. Cole said nothing.
He was looking at the sky, which had turned the deep, saturated gold of a summer evening at the end of a very long day, and his expression was the expression of a man thinking about something that was not on this field at all, something far away and very dear, something he was going to go home to.
Eli looked at the sky too.
Somewhere in western Massachusetts, the summer evening was arriving over a farm where the eastern field was planted, where a patient roan mare was standing in a barn, where two 16-year-old boys were probably breaking something, where a woman with her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness was perhaps standing on the porch in the last of the light, looking east, thinking her own thoughts.
3 years. He had been gone 3 years. And the road was not over yet. He knew this.
He had known it through all of today, through all the months before today, that this was not the end, that the war had more to ask of him before it was finished asking.
But today had been something.
Today the army had held, on ground of the enemy's choosing, in conditions that should have broken it, and it had not broken. It had held and advanced and fired and held again, and at the end of the day it was still there, still itself, still standing.
So was he. The war did not end after Monmouth.
This was perhaps the most difficult thing to absorb, not the fighting itself, not the cold or the hunger or the loss, all of which Eli had learned to carry in the particular way you carry things that cannot be put down, but the simple fact of the war's continuation. The sense that each significant thing, Trenton, Valley Forge, Monmouth, might have been the turn, might have been the moment when Britain decided that the cost was too high, and was not, was simply one more event in a conflict that had acquired, by now, the quality of a permanent condition rather than a temporary crisis.
He wrote to his family more often now than he had in the beginning.
The letters had changed over the years, the way his hands had changed, the same hands, but shaped differently by use, by the accumulation of what they had done. The early letters home had been careful and somewhat formal, the letters of a young man trying to manage what he reported in order to manage how his family felt about what he had chosen. The later letters were different.
More direct.
Less managed.
He wrote about the men he had known and lost. He wrote about Fitch.
He wrote about Cole and the way Cole spoke about Ruth with a reverence that was almost comic in its sincerity and entirely genuine beneath the comedy. He wrote about things he had seen and thought and understood, in the way you write to people you trust absolutely with the real contents of your mind. His mother wrote back with the same practical, compressed warmth she brought to everything. His father wrote less frequently but with the same weighted precision, each letter containing more than its length suggested. Ruth wrote with increasing frequency and decreasing patience for the conventions of letter writing. Her later letters had an almost conversational urgency to them, as though she were talking rather than writing, the sentences arriving quickly and not always finishing before the next one began.
He loved her letters best. He would not have told her this. She would have found it insufferable. But he loved them, the impatience of them, the aliveness of them, the way they smelled faintly of the farm when he unfolded them, or perhaps that was only what he imagined, what he wanted to be true, which sometimes amounted to the same thing. In the autumn of 1778, something happened that had not happened before in all the years of the war. Nothing, for a while.
Not literally nothing. The army moved and drilled and maintained its positions, and the war continued in the South, where British strategy had shifted its attention to the Carolinas and Georgia, and there were actions and skirmishes and the constant low-level activity of armies in proximity.
But Eli's company was not in the South.
They were in the North, in a period of relative stasis, and the particular quality of days that were demanding without being desperate settled over the camp-like weather.
He was not sure, at first, what to do with this.
The rhythms of crisis had been his rhythms for so long that the absence of immediate urgency felt almost disorienting, a silence where noise had been, a stillness where motion had been, the way a river sounds louder when you have just come in from the roar of a waterfall. He found himself looking for things to do with an energy that had been built for harder circumstances and did not know how to modulate itself downward. Fitch observed this with his customary patience. "You're restless," he said one evening,
watching Eli sharpen a knife that did not particularly need sharpening. "I'm fine," Eli said. "I didn't say you weren't fine. I said you were restless. Those are different things." Fitch was quiet for a moment, turning his own thoughts over in that unhurried way of his. "It's harder than the bad times, sometimes. The quiet. That doesn't make sense." "No," Fitch agreed. "It doesn't make sense." And yet, Eli set down the knife. Outside the hut, the autumn evening was doing what autumn evenings do in the northeast, cooling quickly once the sun dropped, the air taking on that clean, slightly melancholy quality that carries in it the memory of summer and the expectation of winter and something in between that has no name but is unmistakable. It smelled, faintly, of wood smoke and fallen leaves, and it was so much like the autumns at home, so precisely, painfully like them, that Eli sat with it for a moment without speaking, breathing it in, letting it be what it was. "Do you miss it?" he asked Fitch. "Home?" Fitch considered the question with the seriousness he gave to all genuine questions. "My wife has been gone 12 years, he said. "My children are grown and scattered. The farm, my brother runs it now. There is a home I remember and a home that exists, and they are not the same place anymore." He paused. "So the honest answer is that I miss something that I am not sure is still there to go back to. Which is a different kind of missing from yours." Eli thought about this. "What do I miss?" he asked, not entirely sure why he was asking. Perhaps because Fitch would tell him something true. Fitch looked at him for a long moment. "You miss the person you were before you knew what you know now," he said, quietly. "You miss the mornings when the worst thing you had to think about was a difficult field. You miss not carrying what you carry." He paused again. "But here's the thing about that kind of missing, Eli. The person you were before he was a good person. A fine young man. But he was not yet this person. And this person can do things that person could not. Can carry things that person could not. Can stand on a field at the end of a day like Monmouth and still be standing." He held Eli's gaze. "You have not lost the person you were. You have grown him into someone larger. That's not loss. That's just what living costs, and what it gives you back." A letter came from Ruth in November that contained news he had not expected. Peter Cole had asked her father for permission to marry her. Her father had given it. The wedding would wait, Ruth wrote, until Peter came home, which was the only part of the arrangement she was impatient with and intended to be impatient with until it was resolved. The rest she seemed, in her careful, brisk, Ruth-like way, to regard with something approaching contentment, which from Ruth was the equivalent of another person dancing in the street. Eli read this by firelight, sitting against the wheel of a supply wagon in the gathering dark of a November evening, and felt the particular compound feeling that good news from home produces in a man who is a long way from it, joy that was also longing, happiness that was also an almost physical ache, the love for the people in the letter pressing against the distance between himself and them with a force that had no useful outlet except the writing of letters, which he did that night, writing longer than he usually did, into the small hours, until the fire was nearly out and his hand was cramped and he had said everything he could think of to say. He told her he was glad. He told her that Cole was a good man. He had seen Cole in every condition that a man can be in, and he was good in all of them, which was the only test that mattered. He told her that the farm sounded beautiful in her letters, that he could almost smell it, that the eastern field, the one he had planted in the spring of 1775, the one his father had kept planting after he left, he thought about it sometimes. He thought about the fact that the planting had continued without him, that the field he had made had gone on being what fields do without requiring his presence, producing its harvest, season after season, and he found this thought not saddening but somehow the opposite. Evidence that the things you begin continue, that the work of your hands outlasts the moment of the doing. He told her to tell their father he was well. He told her to tell their mother the same. He told her to tell the twins, men now 17, which was a thought that still occasionally ambushed him with its strangeness, that he expected them not to have broken anything irreplaceable before he got home. And he told her, at the very end, the thing he had never quite said directly in all the years of writing home,
Perhaps because saying it directly felt too much like conceding the weight of it, that he missed them.
That he missed all of them.
That there was not a day, not one, not in all the years when he had not thought of the farm, and of the particular quality of morning light through the kitchen window, and of patience in the barn, and of the sound of the creek, and of all of them together in that house that their father had built with his own hands before Eli could walk.
That he was coming home. Not yet. The war was not done.
There were things still to be asked of him, and he was not the man who turned away from what was asked, not now, not after everything. But when it was done, when the road finally reached wherever it was going, he was coming home. He sealed the letter and held it in his hands for a moment in the dying firelight. Then he set it with the others to be sent in the morning.
Winter came again.
The third winter of his service, and the most bearable, not because it was less cold than the others, but because he was less afraid of it.
He had survived 2 winters in the field.
He knew what they asked, and he knew he could provide it, and that knowledge, the knowledge of his own sufficiency, the knowledge built not from confidence but from evidence, was a warmth of its own kind that the cold could not entirely reach. Fitch's wound, the one from Bunker Hill, troubled him when the temperature dropped. He managed it without complaint and without drawing attention to it, but Eli had learned to read the slight tightening around Fitch's eyes on the coldest mornings, the barely perceptible favoring of his left side, the way he moved with somewhat more deliberateness than usual when the air was at its worst.
He did not mention it. Fitch would not have welcomed the mention.
What he welcomed was company, warmth, the continuation of the ordinary routines that made difficult things manageable, and Eli provided these without comment, the way Fitch had provided them for him, in his turn, on every difficult day of the past 3 years. This was what he had not expected when he left the farm in April of 1775 with his grandfather's musket and his heart in his throat and the April road unrolling before him.
He had not expected to be known like this.
To have someone who had watched him through everything, who had seen him at his worst and his steadiest and every gradation between, and who chose, having seen all of that, to sit beside him in the cold and say nothing and mean everything.
He had not expected friendship like this.
He was grateful for it in a way that had no adequate expression, and so he expressed it, as such things are usually expressed between men who do not have easy words for their feelings, by making sure the fire was kept, and the powder was dry, and the watch was shared, and the miles were walked together, one foot and then the other, toward whatever end the road was finally going to reach. This concludes the second part of the story.
Sleep well. Good night.